welcome to our program. Tonight is our 300th show, which we're very proud of. Thank you for joining us. Our guest tonight is Frank Russo, a former division manager with AT&T and Verizon, and he serves on the executive committees of Long Islanders for Educational Reform, as well as the Nassau County Conservative Party. Frank is also president of the Port Washington Educational Assembly and president of the New York State American Family Association. Frank has an electrical engineering degree from Manhattan College and an MBA from Baruch. He's married for 45 years. He's the father of 7 children and 28 grandchildren. Welcome, Frank.
Thank you.
And our topic tonight is what's wrong with the New York State Legislature? And my co-host, Mike Mulhall.
Thank you, Patty. Frank, congratulations on the 300th episode. To you and all the great people who make this show happen that I've been fortunate to be a part of, my sincere congratulations.
Thanks for your help and Patty's help.
A pleasure. It's been a privilege. Frank, we're talking about what's wrong with the New York State Legislature. Let's begin with 2 bills dealing with the filing of lawsuits for past acts of child abuse. One bill is the Marquis bill and the other is the Lopez bill. In your opinion, what are the key differences in these 2 bills, and what does it tell us about the supporters of each one of these bills?
And it's the second part of that question that I find most interesting. Both these bills are aimed at trying to help victims of child abuse and who are older than age 18. The current law allows someone to file charges against someone for child abuse up until age 23, but only if the abuser worked for a private institution. If the abuser worked for a public institution, like a school, which is where a disproportionate amount of our child sexual abuse occurs, then you cannot file such a lawsuit after age 18 and 3 months. Now, what the Markey bill did was the following. A, it only dealt with the private institution, so it didn't deal with the problem where most child abuse occurs, that is in our public institutions. Just for the record, studies by Dr. Cheryl Shake, she at Hofstra University for the U.S. Department of Education, released in 2004, shows that there are 29,000 cases of child sexual abuse in our public schools each year. Just for purposes of comparison, in the Catholic Church, which had a great scandal, there were some 200 cases of child abuse per year. 200 cases in the Catholic Church. You read all about it in about 100 stories in the New York Times and Newsday. 29,000 cases per year in our public schools. Not a blessed word about it back then.
Is it fair to say, though, so just so our audience gets an understanding of how disproportionate that is, the private school system, the Catholic school system would be maybe, what, 10% of the overall, right?
Right.
So we're looking at a multiple. If we were
Still
saying 29,000 versus 200,
that's right.
It's actually 10 to 1. Would that be
that's
fair?
Right. It's a big multiple. When you adjust for the number of public school employees versus church employees and so forth, it still comes out that there's a far higher rate of child sexual abuse in our public institutions than in our religious institutions. The Markey bill, again, continued the now they've been changes. The Markey bill has just been changed for the another time. Now it's suddenly going to include the public institutions, but up until just recently, for 3 years, Assemblywoman Markey of Queens has been proposing a legislation which continued to protect child sex abusers in public institutions, mainly in our public schools. What she was proposing was that, A, she extends the statute of limitations from age 23 to age 28. I don't really disagree with that. Lopez extends it from age 23 to age 25. I'd go with either 25 or 28. I don't really draw much of a distinction between those two. They could each make a case on that. But what Markey does, she also does 2 other things. She fails to address the exemption for public employees' child abuse, abuse committed by public employees, mostly in our schools. And second, she opens for 1 year, an unlimited window. Actually, she did. She just modified that also. What she said was, for 1 year, you can sue going back 50, 60 years. She has since modified that. Now she's saying up until age 53. So if you were abused at age 8, you can go back 45 years and charge someone, even if the person's dead and so forth, no witnesses and so forth. So I still have a problem.
But just walk us through that, because that's an important distinction. The viewers need to understand that if the person is dead that we're making the claim against, then...
What's going to happen is the church or the synagogue or the Boy Scouts or the Girl Scouts or the Youth League or whatever it is, the PAL League, any private institution, typically what they're going to do is settle, because to fight the case and get a lawyer is going to cost them $200,000, $300,000. So typically they're going to settle. And if there are 1,000 such cases, right, you're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in damages to churches and synagogues and police athletic leagues and Boy Scouts and so forth.
Even in cases where someone has not been found guilty.
Right, because the person is probably dead or there's no witnesses and you can't prove it. You could not prove it criminally, where you have to have 98, 99% certainty. In a civil lawsuit, you just need 51%, you know, proof, so to speak, and where the jury sympathizes with the victim, and even though it hasn't been proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
So unless you're someone who's familiar with the law, you need to understand the distinctions between the civil law and between the legal matter.
Criminal law.
And so there is a difference between that would be viewed, and thus the consequence is quite severe in terms of the financial penalty it would impose.
Absolutely, and that's why we have the concept of, it's called SOL, statute of limitations. It says we want to be reasonable to both the defendant and the plaintiff. And we're saying that you have to bring your charges within some reasonable period of time. And I would say the current age 23 seems reasonable. If they want to extend it to 25, that seems okay, 28 even. To go to 53, in my judgment, is imprudent. But what was even worse was that up until recently, Markey was exempting the places where most child abuse occurred, in our public schools. But after a lot of hearing from ordinary residents, thousands and thousands of people, to our state senators and state assembly people, she's now modified that and said, I'll include the public employees, which now suddenly call the public schools, and the public school superintendents are suddenly now take a position opposing her bill.
So if I understand you correctly, then your criticism, and many others who would share this criticism, was that you felt there was an equal form of justice here. It wasn't equal in way of its application.
Blatantly discriminatory.
Originally.
Blatantly discriminatory, and what it suggests is that the two groups of people that were largely supporting it, it was certain liberal Democrats and what I view as anti-religious, especially anti-Christian bigots.
So are you saying there's bigotry as a problem in New York State in terms of the legislature?
It's a big problem, and I found it predominantly amongst the Democrats, who were the big supporters of the Markey bill. The Lopez bill did not have this one-year open window, did not have the exemption. It removed the exemption protecting public employees. So Lopez, a Democrat assemblyman from the city of New York, was removing the protection given public employees so that both public and private employees would be treated equally. He did it fairly. The Lopez bill is very good. Extended the age to 25, I have no problem with that, it was reasonable. He did not have what I call this stupid open window for 1 year where you can go back 40 years and charge someone with a crime that you'll never be able to prove in 99% of the cases, and you're going to cause these institutions to go bankrupt many times in order to settle all these claims. And now that the public schools are included, it's going to put a tremendous burden on the taxpayers, because if people start accusing teachers or employees of public schools of child abuse 30 and 40 years ago, the public schools are, in order to avoid
hundreds
millions of dollars
dollars
in legal costs, they're going to have to make settlements equal to that in hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars. So it's a stupid bill, the Markey bill. Why she did it and why so many Democrats supported it, I think, was hostility to the Catholic Church, which has suffered from the image of the child abuse, which was terrible, which again amounted to 11,000 cases over 50 years, roughly 220 cases per year.
And that's not to minimize those 11,000 cases.
No,
but
terrible.
what we're trying to make the argument, I think,
Treat
in fairness,
everyone the same.
Correct, but also look at that in context versus all cases of all
Child abuse. Why should a victim of child abuse in a public school not have the same rights as the victim of child abuse committed by a Boy Scout leader or a church leader or a rabbi or someone like that? They should all be treated the same. The statute of limitations concept, I think, is one of just prudence and common sense. You don't want these private institutions or public schools to have to pay damages which are just indefensible and not properly justifiable, because you can't explain what happened 40 years ago. Witnesses don't exist.
Even if the person isn't dead, you could have the case where somebody's in their 80s or their 90s, they're incapacitated, they're not around, and you have the issue of somebody being falsely accused. That certainly happened many times. What about legislation currently on the books in New York State about child abuse? Well,
okay, and is one other point on the bigotry, just to get back to that. You know, bigotry is a problem in New York State. Someone asked me that question. Okay, it is a problem. You know, I've seen cases of bigotry based on race, and both ways, by the way. You know, white bigotry against blacks, and there are more whites, and so it's more prevalent to see white bigotry against blacks. But there's also black bigotry toward whites, and no one talks about that problem. That's also a problem. There's problems of bigotry against Jewish people, anti-Semitism. I remember hearing a friend of someone I knew, a friend of mine, happened to say something I thought possibly indicated anti-Semitic attitudes, and it was right by, it was in March, right before the Feast of St. Joseph, patron saint. The Italians have a big feast day for St. Joseph. And I said to this person, I said, well, St. Joseph's Day is coming up. What religion was St. Joseph? He honestly didn't know. I said, St. Joseph, of course, the father of Jesus, was Jewish. I said, in fact, Jesus is Jewish. Blessed Mother is Jewish. St. Peter, the first pope, was Jewish. All the apostles were Jewish. How could you be anti-Semitic? These are the people who started the Catholic Church, the Christian faith. And he was dumbfounded for a bit. But in addition to what the typical thing I see, this is the main point, a lot of the anti-black bigotry and the anti-Semitism, I find, overwhelmingly occurs in the lower socioeconomic classes. People are not well educated. What I find is that the anti-Christian bigotry, which is, no one talks about it, but there's a lot of anti-Christian bigotry, I've seen it in my community in Port Washington, occurs among the upper socioeconomic classes. It's very interesting. It's not the lower, it's the upper.
But do you believe that within that is a significant attack, really, against the Catholic Church to some extent?
I don't want to say significant. In other words, bigotry is not a huge problem.
But when people point to the Christian faith, it seems as though the Catholic Church has become somewhat of a target, a rich target, because of the pedophilia scandal.
In terms of these bills.
Correct.
Well, to me, there was a lot of anti-Catholicism behind the Markey bill. It was so blatantly discriminatory.
How else could you explain leaving out the public schools?
But for instance, just to make this other point, in my community, there's a person very influential in the public school community, very influential, who, back in the 90s, at a public meeting of our library board, got up and said, I want you to know I find Christianity offensive. The library board members rolled their eyes. The library director rolled her eyes. I didn't know who this person was. After the meeting, I asked people there, who was that who said that? They told me the person's name. I was going to write a letter the next day to my local paper talking about this blatant act of bigoted remarks made at a public meeting. The next morning, this person called me to apologize. Mr. Russo, I just want to tell you I'm very sorry for what I said. Now, at that point, you have to forgive. Someone apologizes, you forgive. But since then, that person has gotten very involved in our public school community, very active. And there have been other incidents also in our public school community that exemplify an attitude hostile to religion, any mention of God, in God we trust. They made a big stink about our national motto and putting up a plaque with our national motto in our schools. There was such a commotion, more letters written on that than any other subject in my memory in 35 years in Port Washington. And other instances indicating a hostility to Christians.
It has become very fashionable, and as Mike said, it does seem to be that the Catholics get the most
It's not just Catholics, against Christians. And it's among upper socioeconomic levels. These are not poor people. These are well-to-do people.
Right.
So while there's acts of anti-Semitism by Christians, there's also a lot of anti-Christian acts by Jewish people. And we've got to all recognize this and stop this nonsense because it's not beneficial to any community.
But in terms of these bills, that would be the only way to understand leaving out public institutions where, as you said, the studies have shown there's far more child abuse going on, whether it's by a school coach or by a teacher or a principal.
Much more in the public schools.
And I think it's been fueled by the media's unbelievable obsession with the abuse in the Catholic Church, which, of course, as Mike said, we're not trying to diminish it, downplay it in any way. There were real victims of that.
Absolutely.
But it was covered ad nauseum over and over again to make it seem as
No
if it
mention
was
of the abuse,
a much larger problem than it was, compared to rarely covering the abuse that goes on in the public schools.
And it occurs there 100 times more often. By the way, another group is a Catholic group, Voice of the Faithful. I invited the head of the Voice of the Faithful, or any representative he wanted to send, Dan Bartley, to come on this show and discuss this, because they were supporting the Markey bill. The Voice of the Faithful, and I'm a member, and you're a member,
As
Mike.
I am too.
I find them led by, and I exempt Dan Bartley from this because I like Dan very much, had him on the show, but too many of them are blatant Catholic dissidents, have hostility to the Catholic Church because they won't make certain changes that these folks want to see. And they were big supporters of the Markey bill. So amongst that bigotry, I see the members of Voice of the Faithful, at least a lot of the leaders of Voice of the Faithful. I exempt Dan Bartley from that. So I just wanted to mention that also.
No.
Now, you also asked me about the current legislation. What was that?
I was asking you about what's on the books in New York State now, before these bills
For
came
child
up.
abuse?
For child abuse.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know this, and this has been the case when the Catholic Church scandal arose in '02. They found out that clergy, Jewish, Catholic, Protestant clergy, Muslim clergy, were not on the list of mandated reporters. People who routinely deal with children who are obliged by the law to report knowledge of child sexual abuse. So they said, well, let's correct that and add these clergy to the list of mandated reporters. Then suddenly, and they were all set to do this in Albany, some genius up in Albany found out, wait a second, it's not going to solve the problem, because the only child abuse that has to be reported by law, by mandated reporters, is child abuse committed by the parent or guardian, which is about a quarter of all child abuse. 3/4 of all child abuse would still not have to be reported. So then they said, logically, let's require all child sexual abuse to be reported. And that's not happened. In 7 years, it's still not happened. Why? Because New York Civil Liberties Union, Planned Parenthood objected. They did not want to require their Planned Parenthood clinics to have to report when a 13-year-old girl comes in for contraceptives or an abortion that her boyfriend is 21, it's statutory rape, it would be a case of legal child abuse, and they didn't want to have to report it. So today, the law in New York is unchanged, and that means that 75% of all child sexual abuse is not required to be reported by these mandated reporters.
That is incredible, and it boggles the mind, because when you think of the disparity between Planned Parenthood and, let's just say, for example, the Catholic Church, with all its failings, it fails to recognize all the good that the Catholic Church has established in society, but in particular the benefits it drives in the state of New York through health care and education. Education alone, we know the benefit to New York State residents, taxpayers, is in excess of $8 billion annually by educating over 400,000 people. And the health care system, it's multiples more money. And so to put them and Planned Parenthood on equal footing already is in my opinion, is very foolish. But politically, Catholics are one of the largest voting blocs in the state of New York.
And if that Markey bill passed, it would bankrupt those Catholic services, adoption services, health services. A lot of these would have to be closed down in order to pay the claims, because they couldn't afford to fight these lawsuits, some of which would be valid and some of which would be invalid, and there's no way to discern between the two reasonably.
And I would be fair, too. I'd like your opinion, because I thought Newsday wrote a very interesting editorial on the topic, and I'd love your thoughts on that matter.
Well, I have to compliment Newsday and Channel 12. They both opposed the Markey bill and supported.
If I may stop, News 12 here in Long Island is Cablevision sponsored.
Right.
So we would be recommending that the Cablevision affiliates throughout the state of New York, in particular Peter Kohler, but go on.
Anyway, thank Peter Kohler and Tim Knight of Newsday and their editorial board. They supported the Lopez bill, which is the reasonable bill dealing with reporting child abuse and filing lawsuits. But I have to criticize Joy Brown, a regular columnist in Newsday. I had a long conversation with her. I thought she fully understood the issue, and yet then she wrote another column still justifying the Markey bill with its discrimination. This, at the time, it was discriminating between public employees and private employees, and she continued to support the bill, which exempted the public employees from this litigation. And she only wanted to make private employees susceptible to civil lawsuits, not the public employees, which were accounting for the bulk of all this child abuse. So Joy Brown was a big disappointment.
For our upstate residents, again, Long Island Newsday employs a columnist, Joy Brown, who's a phenomenal writer. I don't always agree with what she espouses, but on this particular issue, it was disappointing, knowing that you had reached out to her, that she didn't choose to correct the record or follow up on that matter.
It really begs the question whether these people are truly looking out for the victim, or if they have an agenda, if they're not willing to include the bulk of where the abuse is. What about your view on the same-sex marriage bill that's being pushed forward right now by the Democratic Party leaders?
The Democratic Party is pushing same-sex marriage. Half a dozen states have adopted it, either by the legislature or mostly by the courts. I'm strongly opposed to it for a whole slew of reasons. One reason is the civil rights of believing Christians, Jews, and Muslims are going to be violated if this happens. In Massachusetts, Catholic Charities had to shut down its adoption services. Once Massachusetts adopted same-sex marriage, Catholic Charities, which would not allow adoption of children by homosexual couples, was forced to change its position or go out of business. They decided to shut down their adoption services because they would not alter their strong belief that it would be wrong to allow adoption of children by homosexuals.
And that was a terrible shame, because they were doing thousands of adoptions a year.
That they'd refer. In addition, there's a lot of data that indicates a disproportionate amount of child abuse is committed by homosexuals. About a third of all child abuse in the country is committed by homosexuals, or only 3% of the nation. So homosexuals are 10 to 15 times more likely to commit child sexual abuse. So it's another reason why adoption by homosexuals, I think, is a problem. So Catholic Charities had to shut down their services. There was a photographer in New Mexico. She didn't want to take...
But can I just explore that for a minute? Because from some of the reading I did on that topic, from what I understood, the Catholic Church in the Boston Archdiocese, when they made that decision, it wasn't just based in terms of application of church teaching and church doctrine. It was also with the mindset that they had to acknowledge the fact that they would be legally responsible if, God forbid, a homosexual couple did adopt a child and a child was the victim of abuse.
They may have, I presume so.
There was, right, it was, it wasn't all religious, you know, for our viewers, I want them to understand that the Catholic Church viewed it in total.
They viewed it as harmful,
Correct.
Regardless, whether it was abuse or for any reason. They did not, I think a child should be brought up in a home with a mother and a father. That's best for the child, and that was their policy. They did not want to allow adoption by homosexuals. They were forced out of business. A photographer, a woman in New Mexico, was asked if she would photograph a lesbian civil union ceremony. She said, no, it violates my moral principles. I'd rather not do it. She was sued. She had to pay damages and had to pay lawyers to defend herself. There's so many cases now arising. There are several dozen cases that have been brought out by Professor Jennifer Morse Robach. She's talked about some 30 or 40 cases that have now illustrated the violations of the civil rights of religious people who view homosexual marriage as wrong. Look what happened in the Miss America contest as an example. There was a gay
The recent
judge.
2009.
Yeah, this woman from California had a good chance of winning, but because she said she believed marriage should be between a man and a woman, the homosexual judge ruled her out, and she came in second. So here you have blatant discrimination, reverse discrimination by a homosexual against a heterosexual Christian, and no talk about it hardly. I haven't seen any mention of, very little mention of it any place. Nothing in Newsday, nothing in the New York Times. So there's discrimination in that direction. In addition, there are economic problems. Here we're facing great fiscal crisis.
Well, that was going to be my next question. We don't want the entire topic to be dominated by our social issues, but let's discuss some of our economic problems and what do you think the future of New York State looks like?
Well, and again, what I was going to say, though, same-sex marriage is going to exacerbate our fiscal problems.
How so?
Because it will put a burden on our state, our county, our towns, our cities to pay pension benefits and health benefits to same-sex couples that they're not obligated to pay now. It will put burden on private companies in New York State. They will not be able to discriminate. They'll have to pay homosexual, lesbian couples pension benefits and health benefits. It's going to increase their costs without the offsetting benefit that's contributed by heterosexual couples, which is the procreation and education of children. Homosexual couples cannot procreate. So therefore, we're going to see an increase in pension and health care costs. Social Security, which is going to go start losing money come 2016, it starts going belly up. It's going to move that up by some period of time because now same-sex couples, if marriage is acknowledged between same-sex couples, they'll be able to claim the higher Social Security benefits. It'll bankrupt Social Security, and not only among homosexuals. You're going to see two guys who are good friends in their 70s or 80s, their wives have died, or two women, and you're going to see, hey, buddy, hey, Joey, listen, when I have a higher Social Security benefit than you, why don't we just get married? We're not having sex or anything, but then when I die, you'll get my higher Social Security benefit. Why won't guys do that, or women do that who are friends?
Yeah, two friends, sure.
So I could see a disastrous economic consequence.
You raise a lot of points that I'd never thought of before, and I think the average person listening to the mainstream media, they're not getting this. They're just getting this whole view of it's compassionate to allow this. They're not thinking of any of the effects beyond even the moral issue. Well, we're about at the halfway point of our program, believe it or not. Our guest is Frank Russo, and we're discussing what is wrong with the New York State Legislature tonight. We're going to take a brief break, and we'll be right back with you.